The year was 1878. Under the relentless Montana sun, a lone figure stood beside his weathered trunk on the dusty platform of Willow Creek's train station. Jackson Miller wiped the sweat from his brow and squinted at the handwritten address clutched in his hand. After traveling over 2,000 miles from Boston, he had finally arrived to meet his bride, a woman he knew only through 6 months of correspondence and a single daguerreotype. What awaited him at the Caldwell homestead wasn't the fresh start he had envisioned, but rather a cruel twist of fate that would test not only his resolve, but also his understanding of love, deception, and second chances in the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jackson Miller had never considered himself a desperate man, but circumstances had a way of reshaping one's perspective. At 32, he had buried both his medical practice and his hopes for a conventional life back in Boston after the devastating fire that had claimed his clinic and home. The aftermath had left him with little more than his medical bag, a handful of personal possessions, and the crushing weight of debt from a business loan he could no longer service. The advertisement in the Boston Chronicle had seemed like providence. Respected young woman of good family seeks educated husband to help establish medical practice in growing Montana township. Land deed included. The accompanying correspondence address belonged to a Miss Abigail Caldwell of Willow Creek, Montana. 6 months of letters had followed, cautious at first, then increasingly warm and detailed. Jackson learned that Abigail was 26, the daughter of a successful rancher who had died the previous year, leaving her and her sister a considerable homestead. She had nursing experience gained during a 2-year apprenticeship in Helena and dreamed of bringing proper medical care to the growing communities scattered across their valley. "We may not have the sophistication of Boston," Abigail had written in her flowing script, "but there is dignity in this land and its people. What we lack in amenities, we make up for in determination." For a man with nothing left to lose, the proposition had offered everything he needed: purpose, partnership, and the chance to practice medicine without the shadow of his Boston failures. By the time he boarded the westbound train, Jackson had convinced himself that practical arrangements often made for more successful marriages than romantic entanglements. Now, as he stood on the Willow Creek platform with his trunk at his feet, Jackson couldn't deny the flutter of anxiety in his chest. The daguerreotype tucked inside his jacket pocket showed a serious-faced young woman with clear eyes and a determined set to her jaw. He had studied that image so many times during the journey that he felt he would recognize Abigail Caldwell instantly. "Dr. Miller, I presume?" a deep voice called, interrupting his thoughts. Jackson turned to find a barrel-chested man in his 50s approaching with a purposeful stride. "Sheriff Thomas Burke," the man continued, extending a calloused hand. "Miss Caldwell asked me to collect you. Said she had matters to attend to at home before your arrival." "Yes, I'm Jackson Miller," he confirmed, shaking the sheriff's hand. "I appreciate the welcome." The sheriff helped load Jackson's trunk into a buckboard wagon waiting nearby. As they settled onto the wooden seat, Burke clicked his tongue at the team of horses and guided them away from the station. "First time in Montana territory?" Burke asked, navigating the wagon onto a rutted dirt road leading away from the small cluster of buildings that constituted Willow Creek. "It is," Jackson admitted, taking in the sweeping landscape of golden prairie grasses and distant purple mountains, different from Massachusetts in every possible way. The sheriff chuckled. "You'll find more than the landscape different out here, Doc. People, too. We make do with less fuss, but face harder challenges. Glad to have another physician, though. Nearest doctor's in Helena. 3 days' ride in good weather." They traveled for nearly an hour, the wagon climbing steadily toward a valley nestled between rolling hills. Sheriff Burke occasionally pointed out landmarks: the Blackwell sheep farm, Peterson's general store, and post office at a crossroads, the newly constructed schoolhouse where community gatherings were held. "The Caldwell place is just beyond that ridge," Burke explained, gesturing ahead. "One of the better homesteads in the valley. Old Samuel Caldwell chose well when he settled here 15 years ago. Good water, sheltered position, decent grazing." Jackson nodded, wondering about the family he was joining. "Abigail mentioned a sister in her letters. Has she lived on the homestead all this time as well?" Something flickered across Sheriff Burke's weathered face. Discomfort, perhaps, or hesitation. "The Caldwell girls. Well, they're what you might call identical in appearance, but not in temperament. You'll see for yourself soon enough." Before Jackson could press for clarification, the wagon crested the ridge, revealing a well-maintained homestead spread across a gentle slope. A substantial two-story house built of squared logs anchored the property, flanked by a large barn, corral, and several outbuildings. A creek wound through the lower pasture where cattle grazed placidly. "This is more established than I imagined," Jackson remarked, genuinely impressed. "Samuel Caldwell didn't do anything halfway," Burke replied. "Built this place to last generations." As they approached the house, Jackson noticed a slender figure in a blue dress step onto the porch. His heart quickened, despite his best efforts at professional detachment. This was the moment he had alternately anticipated and dreaded throughout the long journey west. The wagon rolled to a stop in the yard. Sheriff Burke jumped down first, then offered a hand to help Jackson descend. As they approached the porch, Jackson studied the woman waiting for them. Her chestnut hair was arranged in a simple but elegant knot, her posture straight and dignified. She matched the daguerreotype he carried, though the photograph hadn't captured the weariness around her eyes or the tight set of her mouth. "Miss Caldwell," Sheriff Burke said, removing his hat. "I've brought your guest as requested." "Thank you, Thomas," she replied, her voice softer than Jackson had imagined from her letters. "I appreciate your assistance." Jackson stepped forward, hat in hand. "Miss Abigail Caldwell, I presume. I'm Jackson Miller. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person after our correspondence." A flash of something, alarm, distress, crossed her features before she composed herself. "Dr. Miller, welcome to our home. I'm Eleanor Caldwell, Abigail's twin sister." Jackson blinked in confusion. Twin sister? Abigail mentioned a sister, but she never— "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside," Eleanor interrupted gently, glancing at Sheriff Burke, who had suddenly become very interested in adjusting the horse's harness. "There are matters we need to discuss privately." Unease crept along Jackson's spine as he followed Eleanor into the house. The interior was comfortable and well-appointed, with solid furniture, braided rugs, and shelves of books that spoke of education and refinement. Unusual for a frontier home. Eleanor led him to a sitting area and gestured toward an armchair. "Please, Dr. Miller, make yourself comfortable. Would you care for coffee after your journey?" "What I'd care for is an explanation," Jackson replied, remaining standing. "Where is Abigail? I've come thousands of miles based on our agreement, and I find myself greeted by a sister I didn't know existed, at least not as an identical twin." Eleanor sighed, sinking onto a nearby settee. "I was hoping to ease into this conversation, but I see that directness is required." She met his gaze steadily. "My sister Abigail was married 3 weeks ago to James Harrington, the son of a cattle baron from Helena. They're currently visiting his family estate and won't return for another month." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. "Married? But our arrangement, the letters, were written in good faith when she sent them," Eleanor finished for him. James Harrington had been pursuing Abigail for nearly a year, but she had refused him multiple times. She genuinely intended to follow through with your arrangement until Harrington returned with a new proposal that included financing for a proper clinic in town. Jackson felt anger rising in his chest, hot and unfamiliar. and this justified breaking her commitment to me without so much as a telegram. I sold everything I had left in Boston, Miss Caldwell. I arrived here with no prospects beyond what your sister promised. I know, Eleanor said quietly, and I would have sent word had I known sooner. Abigail only informed me of her change in plans after the wedding was performed. By then you were already traveling west. She hesitated before continuing. My sister has always been pragmatic in her decisions. The Harrington connection offered advantages she felt couldn't be refused. Jackson paced the room, struggling to process this development. Everything he had counted on had evaporated in an instant. So I'm simply to turn around and head back. East? With what resources exactly? Eleanor stood, her hands clasped before her. That's what I wished to discuss with you, Dr. Miller. I have a proposal of my own. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jackson stared at Eleanor Caldwell, momentarily speechless. A proposal, he finally managed, studying her face for any trace of mockery. He found none, only a composed determination that reminded him of the letters he had received over the past 6 months. Please, sit down, Eleanor said, gesturing once more to the armchair. This time Jackson complied, his exhaustion from the journey finally catching up with him. Eleanor resumed her seat on the settee opposite him. I understand your situation completely, she began, smoothing her skirts with practiced hands. You've traveled across the country based on promises made by my sister, only to find those promises broken. It's unconscionable, and I apologize on Abigail's behalf, though I know that counts for little. Your sister should deliver her own apologies, Jackson replied stiffly. She should, Eleanor agreed with surprising candor. But I've learned not to expect actions from Abigail that don't align with her immediate interests. A shadow crossed her face. We may look identical, Dr. Miller, but I assure you, we are very different women. Eleanor rose and crossed to a sideboard, where she poured 2 cups of coffee from a waiting pot. She handed one to Jackson before returning to her seat. What did my sister tell you about our situation here? Jackson accepted the cup gratefully, the familiar aroma momentarily grounding him. That your father passed last year, leaving the homestead to both of you. That she had nursing training and wanted to establish a medical practice to serve the community. Eleanor nodded. That much is true. What she likely omitted is that I was the one who trained alongside her in Helena, that the homestead is equally mine, and that the dream of bringing medical care to this valley was something we once shared. She paused. Before James Harrington entered the picture, Jackson sipped his coffee, considering her words. Are you suggesting that you wish to honor the arrangement your sister made? In essence, yes, Eleanor replied, though the terms would necessarily differ. I'm not Abigail, and I won't pretend to be. I won't offer the kind of companionship my sister implied in her letters, at least not immediately. A faint blush colored her cheeks. But I can offer partnership, Dr. Miller. This community desperately needs a physician. The land promised to you, 20 acres at the north end of our property with access to the creek, remains available. The funds set aside for establishing a medical practice remain untouched. Jackson's medical instincts, honed through years of observing patients, told him there was more to Eleanor's story than she was revealing. Why would you do this for a stranger, Miss Caldwell? Especially one who was meant to marry your sister. Eleanor set her cup down carefully. Because I keep my promises, even those made by others in my family. Because this valley needs a doctor more than ever, with 3 new families settling since winter's end and more expected by fall. She met his gaze directly. And because with Abigail now tied to the Harrington interests, I find myself in need of allies I can trust. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily as Jackson considered her words. "You mentioned immediately," he said finally. "What exactly are you proposing for our arrangement?" "A business partnership to start," Eleanor answered promptly, as if she had anticipated the question. "You establish your practice on Caldwell land, with my assistance as a trained nurse. We present a united front to the community and to the Harringtons, who have been pressuring me to sell my share of the homestead since the wedding." Her hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. "In time, if we find ourselves compatible, beyond business matters, we might consider a more permanent arrangement. But I won't promise what I'm not certain I can deliver, Dr. Miller." "Jackson," he corrected automatically, his mind racing to process this unexpected turn of events. "If we're to be partners of any kind, you should use my given name." A slight smile softened Eleanor's features. "Jackson, then, and I'm Eleanor, not Ellie or Nora, as some insist on calling me." "Does this arrangement have a time frame, Eleanor?" he asked, setting his empty cup aside. "I'd prefer clarity from the beginning." "1 year," she replied without hesitation. "Give me 1 year of partnership. If at that point either of us wishes to dissolve our arrangement, I'll provide funds sufficient for you to establish yourself elsewhere." She leaned forward slightly. "But I hope you'll find, as I have, that this valley has a way of becoming home to those who give it a chance." Jackson stood and walked to the window, looking out over the well-maintained homestead. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, gilding the scene in warm light that belied the turmoil of his thoughts. He had come west for a fresh start, for security, for purpose. Eleanor's offer preserved those essentials, if not the precise arrangement he had expected. "What would you tell the community?" he asked, turning back to face her. "Surely they're aware of your sister's plans. Won't they find it strange that I'm partnering with you instead?" Eleanor stood as well. "The truth, or a version of it, that circumstances changed, but the need for a doctor hasn't. Most folks here care more about having medical care available than the particulars of who's providing it." She crossed to join him at the window. "The Harringtons may spread rumors, but their influence only extends so far. Results and reliability matter more in Montana than gossip." A heavy knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Sheriff Burke's voice called from the porch. "Miss Caldwell, Doc Miller, everything all right in there?" Eleanor exchanged a glance with Jackson before answering. "We're fine, Thomas. Thank you for your concern." "Just checking," the sheriff replied. "I've unloaded the doc's trunk onto the porch. Need to head back to town before dark." "One moment," Eleanor called, then turned to Jackson. "I need to give him some mail for the morning stage. Will you consider my offer while I'm gone? You don't have to decide this minute, but—" She hesitated. "I would appreciate knowing if you're staying the night at least," Jackson nodded. "I'll have an answer when you return." After Eleanor stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind her, Jackson moved through the sitting room, taking stock of his surroundings more carefully. The home spoke of stability and permanence, qualities his life had lacked since the fire. Framed botanical drawings hung on one wall, executed with scientific precision. Medical texts lined one bookshelf, alongside volumes of poetry, history, and natural philosophy. On a small writing desk in the corner, he noticed a leather-bound journal open to a page filled with the same handwriting he recognized from the letters he'd received, but the signature at the bottom wasn't Abigail's. It was Eleanor's. A suspicion began to form in his mind. Before he could investigate further, the front door opened, and Eleanor returned. "Sheriff Burke is gone," she announced, then noticed where Jackson stood. Her cheeks flushed slightly. "I see you found my journal. Did you write them?" he asked directly. "The letters I received in Boston, were they from you or Abigail?" Eleanor's composure wavered momentarily before she squared her shoulders. The arrangement was Abigail's idea. The advertisement was placed in her name. "But yes, I wrote most of the letters, especially in the later months. She moved to the desk and closed the journal carefully. Abigail has many talents, but sustained correspondence isn't among them. She asked me to help, claiming she didn't have the knack for it. So when I read about dreams of bringing medical care to this valley, those were your dreams, not hers, Jackson said, pieces falling into place. Yes, Eleanor admitted, though I believed at the time that she shared them. I didn't realize until after her wedding that the medical practice was merely a convenient narrative to secure a husband with the right qualifications. She looked down at her hands. I should have recognized the pattern. Abigail has always been skilled at adapting her ambitions to match her current prospects. Jackson felt an odd mixture of disappointment and relief. The woman whose thoughts had intrigued him through months of correspondence stood before him now, not as he had expected, but present nonetheless. "I'll stay," he said abruptly. Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "You'll accept my offer, just like that?" "For now," Jackson clarified. "One night at least. Perhaps longer if we can agree on specific terms for this partnership." He managed a wry smile. "It seems I've been corresponding with you all along, Eleanor Caldwell. I'm curious to discover if the person I've come to know through letters exists in reality as well." For the first time since his arrival, genuine emotion transformed Eleanor's features: relief, hope, and something like cautious joy. "I believe you'll find I'm exactly as I presented myself, Dr. Miller. Perhaps more direct, in person than proper correspondence allows, but essentially the same." "Then we have a foundation to build upon," Jackson said, extending his hand as he would to a business partner. "Shall we see what we can make of this unexpected situation?" Eleanor hesitated only briefly before clasping his hand firmly. "Welcome to Montana, Jackson Miller. It's not the arrival either of us anticipated, but perhaps it's the one we needed." As they shook hands, the setting sun broke through the western windows, filling the room with golden light that seemed to Jackson like a tentative promise, not of the future he had journeyed toward, but of one he might yet create from the ashes of broken arrangements and unexpected truths. The following morning found Jackson awake before dawn, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling of the guest bedroom. He had slept fitfully, his dreams filled with train journeys that never ended and identical. Women who kept switching places when he wasn't looking. Rising from the bed, he moved to the window that overlooked the eastern pastures of the Caldwell homestead. The first hints of daylight kissed the distant mountains, painting them in shades of lavender and gold. Below, a figure moved purposefully. Across the yard toward the barn, Eleanor, already beginning her day. Jackson watched as she disappeared into the structure, emerging moments later with a milk pail and stool. There was efficiency in her movements, a practiced rhythm that spoke of years of routine. This wasn't the delicate existence he'd imagined for Abigail based on their correspondence. The woman he'd envisioned would have hired help for such tasks, but Eleanor, it seemed, was comfortable with the practical demands of homestead life. After dressing quickly, Jackson made his way downstairs. The kitchen was empty but welcoming. A pot of coffee simmered on the stove, and a place had been set at the table with a note propped against a plate of biscuits. "Breakfast duties await. Help yourself to coffee. We can discuss specifics of our arrangement when I return." Jackson poured himself coffee and took a biscuit, still warm from the oven. Through the kitchen window, he could see Eleanor now, seated on a stool beside a Jersey cow, her hands working in the rhythmic motion of milking. The domesticity of the scene struck him as both foreign and oddly comforting. His medical practice in Boston had consumed him so completely that everyday routines had become afterthoughts. Meals were often taken at his desk between patients or skipped entirely during busy periods. Here, the daily patterns of life seemed to anchor rather than intrude upon the day's purpose. By the time Eleanor returned with a brimming pail of milk, Jackson had finished his modest breakfast and was examining a handwritten ledger he'd found on a nearby shelf. "I see you've discovered our accounts," Eleanor remarked, setting the milk pail on a workbench. "Not the most cheerful morning reading. Actually, I find it quite informative," Jackson replied, closing the book respectfully. "You've maintained detailed records of every household and medical expense. Very thorough." Eleanor smiled faintly as she strained the milk through cheesecloth into a large ceramic crock. "My father insisted we understand the business of ranching, as well as the practical skills. Said too many homesteaders fail, not from lack of hard work, but from poor accounting." Jackson nodded appreciatively. "A wise perspective. I wish I'd been as meticulous with my clinic's finances." "The fire that destroyed your practice," Eleanor said, washing her hands at the pump sink. "You mentioned it in your letters, but never in detail. Was it truly as devastating as you implied?" Jackson's expression sobered. "More so. I'd built the practice over 8 years, starting with nothing but my medical degree and borrowed equipment. By last year, I had 3 examination rooms, a small surgical theater and a dispensary." He gazed into his coffee cup, seeing not the dark liquid, but the ash-strewn ruins of his former life. "The fire started in the bakery next door. By the time the alarm was raised, flames had already reached my building." "Were there casualties?" Eleanor asked softly, settling into the chair across from him. "No deaths, thank God," Jackson replied, "but several serious injuries among those fighting the blaze. I treated them in the street by lamplight, using what supplies I could salvage." He paused, the memory still raw. "The irony was that while treating others, I neglected to secure my own property. Looters took advantage of the chaos to steal what little the fire had spared." Eleanor's expression reflected genuine sympathy. "And your home? The apartment above the clinic was similarly destroyed. I lost everything except what I'd stored in a bank vault, my father's pocket watch, my mother's wedding band, and a few important documents." Jackson straightened, pushing away the memories. "But we needn't dwell on past misfortunes. I'm more interested in our potential future partnership." Eleanor nodded, pouring herself coffee before sitting across from him. "Then let's address the practicalities. I've prepared a draft agreement." She retrieved a document from a nearby drawer and placed it between them. "I believe in clear terms from the outset." Jackson raised an eyebrow, impressed by her preparedness. "You drafted this last night." "I prefer to be thorough," she replied simply. As Jackson reviewed the document, he found himself nodding with increasing approval. The terms were fair, even generous. 20 acres of prime land with water rights, use of the homestead's existing medical supplies, and a modest stipend from the Caldwell accounts until the practice began generating income. In exchange, Jackson would provide medical care to the homestead and establish regular office hours for the surrounding community. "This is quite comprehensive," he remarked, looking up from the document. "Though I notice you've left the personal aspects of our arrangement deliberately vague." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I thought it best. Business agreements can be specified in contracts. Personal relationships cannot and should not be." "A fair point," Jackson conceded. "Though I'm curious about how you envision our partnership being perceived by the community." Eleanor folded her hands on the table. "The simplest explanation is often best. You came west based on correspondence with the Caldwell family to establish a medical practice. Circumstances changed, but the essential arrangement remains valid." She paused. "As for our personal relationship, I suggest we allow it to develop naturally, without false pretenses or predetermined obligations." "And if the community assumes more than exists between us," Jackson pressed, "then we neither confirm nor deny their assumptions," Eleanor replied pragmatically. "Rural communities thrive on speculation. Better to let them wonder than to provide definitive answers that might later prove awkward or limiting." Jackson couldn't help but smile at her practical approach. You've given this considerable thought. I've lived in this valley most of my life, Dr. Miller. I understand its social dynamics. She rose and moved to the stove to refresh their coffee. Now, would you like to see the land parcel I've proposed for your practice? They spent the morning touring the northern section of the Caldwell property. The 20 acres Eleanor had designated included a gentle rise overlooking the creek, with abundant building sites and good drainage, essential factors Jackson might not have considered on his own. A small cabin already existed near the property. Line, originally built as a line shack for ranch hands working the distant pastures. This could serve as temporary housing while you establish your practice, Eleanor explained as they approached the simple structure. It's basic but sound. My father built it to withstand Montana winters. The cabin proved larger than it had appeared from a distance. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small bedroom, and a lean-to that could serve as a storage area or workshop. Though dusty from disuse, the building was fundamentally solid. With some cleaning and minor repairs, this would be perfectly adequate, Jackson assessed, mentally cataloguing the work needed. Though eventually I'd want to build a proper combined home and medical office closer to the main road. Eleanor nodded. That land there, she pointed to a flat area about 100 yards away, would be ideal for a more substantial structure. Good visibility from the valley road, level ground for construction, and the creek nearby. As they stood on the rise, surveying the land that could become his, Jackson felt a curious mix of emotions. The disappointment and anger of the previous day hadn't vanished entirely, but they had been tempered by a growing appreciation for Eleanor's straightforward approach and evident good faith. You seem to have considered every detail, he remarked as they started back toward the main house. Not every detail, Eleanor admitted. I haven't yet determined how to address the Harrington situation. James and Abigail will return eventually, and their reaction to our arrangement is unpredictable. Jackson glanced at her profile, noting the tension that had entered her expression. You mentioned they've been pressuring you to sell your share of the homestead. Why? Eleanor's pace slowed slightly. The Harrington cattle operation is expanding. They want this land for grazing and water rights, not for its existing operations. Abigail knew this when she accepted James's proposal, but she assumed I would. Simply follow her lead as I often have in the past. Her voice took on an edge Jackson hadn't heard before. This time, I refused. Creating a rift between you, Jackson surmised. More than a rift, Eleanor confirmed. The night before her wedding, Abigail told me I was being selfish and short-sighted, that by refusing to sell, I was jeopardizing her future standing with the Harrington family. She shook her head. She couldn't understand that this land isn't just property to me. It's my heritage and my future. They walked in silence for a moment before Eleanor continued. 2 days after the wedding, Thomas Harrington, James's father, visited personally to make what he called a final generous offer for my share. When I declined, he implied that lone women rarely succeed in managing substantial properties, and that unfortunate accidents sometimes befall stubborn landowners in remote areas. Jackson stopped walking. That sounds remarkably like a threat. It was meant to be, Eleanor confirmed, meeting his gaze directly, which is partly why your arrival is so fortuitous despite the circumstances. A respected physician as my partner strengthens my position considerably. Understanding dawned on Jackson. So I provide medical legitimacy for your nursing ambitions, security through my presence on the property, and a complication to the Harringtons' plans for acquisition. While I provide land, local connections, nursing assistance, and financial stability until your practice is established, Eleanor completed the thought. A mutually beneficial arrangement. Wouldn't you agree? Looking at her standing there, forthright, intelligent, and surprisingly vulnerable despite her composure, Jackson made his decision. I accept your terms, Eleanor Caldwell, he he said formally, extending his hand as he had the previous evening. "Both the written ones and those we've discussed here. I believe we can build something worthwhile together." This time when Eleanor took his hand, her grip was firmer, her smile less guarded. "Then welcome to your new home, Dr. Miller. We have much work ahead of us." As they sealed their agreement with a handshake, a rider appeared on the distant road leading to the homestead, moving fast, hunched low over the saddle. Eleanor's expression shifted immediately. "Something's wrong," she said, already starting toward the house. "That's Ben Tucker's boy, and he wouldn't ride like that unless there was trouble." Jackson fell into step beside her, medical instincts already engaged. Their new partnership, it seemed, was about to face its first test. The young rider thundered into the yard, his horse lathered with sweat. He couldn't have been more than 14, with a shock of sandy hair and freckles standing out against his pale face. Eleanor reached him first, as he practically tumbled from the saddle. "Ethan, what's happened?" she demanded, steadying the boy. "It's Pa," the boy gasped, trembling with exertion. "Mining accident up at Copper Creek. Shaft collapsed. They pulled him out, but he's bad hurt. Ma sent me to fetch you, Miss Caldwell. Said you'd know what to do till the doc from Helena gets here." Eleanor's expression tightened. "Helena's 2 days away at best." She turned to Jackson. "Ben Tucker has a claim. In the foothills 15 miles northeast. Been working it for 3 years now." Jackson stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Miller. I've just arrived from Boston, but I'm fully qualified. I'll need details about the injuries." The boy looked from Eleanor to Jackson with desperate hope. "His leg's all crushed up, and he can't feel nothing below his chest. There's blood coming from his ears, and he keeps passing out." Jackson's medical mind catalogued the symptoms: potential spinal injury, possible internal bleeding, traumatic limb damage. "I'll need my medical bag. It's still packed in my trunk." Eleanor was already moving toward the house. "I'll gather additional supplies. Ethan, water your horse quickly. We leave in 5 minutes." In a flurry of efficient activity, Jackson retrieved his medical instruments while Eleanor packed bandages, herbal preparations, and splinting materials into saddlebags. She emerged from a storeroom with a bottle of chloroform and another of pure alcohol. "Limited supplies," she explained, seeing his assessment. "But I've been stockpiling what I could get from Helena." Within minutes, they had saddled fresh horses. Eleanor handed Jackson a worn but serviceable medical coat she'd pulled from a trunk. "My father's," she explained briefly, "might help establish your authority." Jackson nodded, appreciating her practical thinking. In emergency situations, patients and family responded better to visual cues of medical authority. The coat was slightly large, but it would serve its purpose. As they mounted their horses, Eleanor turned to the boy. "Ethan, can you maintain this pace back to your father's claim?" The boy nodded vigorously. "Yes'm. I know all the shortcuts." "Then lead on," she commanded, settling into her saddle with the ease of someone raised riding Montana's rough terrain. They rode hard across the valley floor before beginning a steady climb into the forested foothills. Despite the urgency, Eleanor maintained a running commentary for Jackson's benefit, identifying landmarks and describing the Tucker family situation. Ben Tucker was a blacksmith back east before gold fever brought him west. Decent man, steady. Worker. Wife Mary keeps their small farm running while he works the claim. 3 children. Ethan here is the eldest, then Sarah, who's 10, and little James, who's just 4. Jackson appreciated the background. Understanding a patient's family circumstances often proved as valuable as medical history. Has he had previous injuries or health concerns? Broke his arm 2 winters back. It healed clean. No major illnesses since they settled here, Eleanor replied. Strong constitution, generally. After an hour's hard riding, they entered a narrow canyon where a small cluster of cabins huddled near a rushing stream. Several men stood outside the largest structure, their expressions grim. They straightened as the riders approached. "Miss Caldwell," one called, removing his hat. "Mary's inside with him. It's bad." Eleanor dismounted smoothly, already retrieving supplies from her saddlebags. "This is Dr. Miller, recently arrived from Boston. He'll need details on exactly how the accident occurred." Jackson followed her lead, noting how effectively she'd established his credentials without explanation or apology. The miners looked at him with newfound hope, their postures shifting subtly from dejection to attentiveness. "Blasting powder set off a collapse," a bearded miner explained as they hurried toward the cabin. "Ben was deeper in than the rest of us. Timber support caught him across the back, while rocks crushed his lower half. Took us near an hour to dig him out." Inside the cabin, the air hung heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the sharper tang of fear. Mary Tucker, a slight woman with careworn features, looked up from where she knelt beside a makeshift pallet. Her hands were stained crimson, pressing a cloth against her husband's mangled leg. "Miss Caldwell, thank God," she breathed, then registered Jackson's presence. "Who's Dr. Miller?" Eleanor supplied, already moving to assess the injured man. "Recently established at the Caldwell homestead. You're fortunate he was available." Jackson set down his medical bag and knelt beside the injured miner. Ben Tucker lay grey-faced and still, his breathing shallow and irregular. Blood had indeed seeped from both ears, suggesting a skull fracture. His right leg was a catastrophic mess of crushed bone and torn flesh, while his torso showed the angry, purple bruising of internal injuries. "Mrs. Tucker, I need to examine your husband thoroughly," Jackson said, his voice calm and authoritative. "Miss Caldwell will assist me. Could you please boil water and prepare clean cloths?" The woman hesitated, reluctant to leave her husband's side. "Mary," Eleanor said gently, "Dr. Miller needs space to work. This is how you can help Ben now." With a jerky nod, Mrs. Tucker retreated to the cabin's small stove. Jackson began his examination, his trained hands moving methodically over the injured man's body, while he murmured his findings to Eleanor. Skull fracture evident. Pupils uneven and sluggish to respond. Multiple rib fractures on the left side. No breath sounds in lower left lung, likely collapsed. Abdomen rigid and distended. Internal bleeding probable. He reached the patient's lower extremities. No response to pain stimulus below the mid-thoracic region. Spinal cord injury likely. Finally, he examined the devastated right leg. After careful assessment, he sat back on his heels and met Eleanor's questioning gaze. "The leg can't be saved," he said quietly, ensuring Mrs. Tucker couldn't overhear. "Tissue damage is too extensive, and he's already showing signs of septicemia. Without amputation, gangrene is certain." Eleanor nodded grimly. "And his other injuries?" "Grave," Jackson admitted. "The spinal damage alone." He left the implication hanging. "What do you need from me?" Eleanor asked, her practical nature asserting itself. "Can you administer chloroform?" "I'll need to perform the amputation immediately if he's to have any chance." Eleanor nodded without hesitation. "I've assisted with procedures before. We should move him to the table for better access." Together, they directed the miners in carefully transferring Tucker to the cabin's sturdy pine table, which Mary had quickly cleared and covered with clean sheets. Jackson arranged his instruments while Eleanor prepared the chloroform mask. "Mrs. Tucker," Jackson said gently, "your husband's leg is severely damaged. To save his life, I must amputate. I won't proceed without your consent." Mary Tucker's face crumpled momentarily before she squared her shoulders. "Do what you must, Doctor. Just save him," Jackson nodded. "I'll need everyone except Miss Caldwell to wait outside. 2 men should remain close in case we need assistance." As the cabin cleared, Jackson and Eleanor exchanged a look of complete understanding. Without a word, they fell into coordinated action, Eleanor administering the chloroform while monitoring the patient's pulse, Jackson preparing his surgical tools. "I'll need you to assist with retraction and ligature," he told her. "Your experiences in Helena should have prepared you for this." "I'm ready," Eleanor confirmed, her voice steady. Jackson made the first incision with swift precision. For the next 30 minutes, they worked in focused silence, broken only by his occasional requests for instruments or Eleanor's reports on the patient's condition. Despite the primitive conditions, Jackson found her assistance invaluable. Her hands were steady, her responses immediate, and her anticipation of his needs nearly intuitive. When he finally tied off the last suture and wrapped the stump in clean bandages, Jackson stepped back, rolling his stiff shoulders. The operation had gone as well as could be expected under the circumstances, but Tucker's other injuries remained beyond their capability to treat. "We've done what we can," he said quietly. "Now we wait." Eleanor nodded, already cleaning the instruments, methodically. "His chances?" Jackson sighed. "If he survives the next 12 hours, perhaps 1 in 3. The spinal injury alone would mean a difficult future, even if he recovers." Mary Tucker was readmitted to sit with her husband while Jackson gave instructions for care and observation. The woman's stoicism impressed him. She asked practical questions about changing bandages and monitoring fever, her focus entirely on concrete actions she could take. As afternoon faded toward evening, Jackson and Eleanor prepared to depart. They had done all they could. Tucker remained unconscious but stable for the moment. "I'll return tomorrow to check his condition," Jackson promised. "Send word immediately if his breathing worsens or fever spikes." Outside, the gathering of miners had grown. News of the doctor's arrival had spread through the small mining community, and several men approached with requests for Jackson to examine various ailments while he was there. A festering hand wound, a persistent cough, a child's mysterious rash. Eleanor watched with quiet approval as Jackson addressed each concern efficiently yet compassionately, dispensing what medications he could from his limited supplies and promising more comprehensive care once his practice was established. "Word will spread," she murmured, as they finally mounted their horses for the return journey. "By this time tomorrow, half the valley will know a new doctor has arrived." Jackson nodded, understanding the significance. In isolated communities, such news traveled with remarkable speed. "It wasn't how I planned to announce my presence, but I suppose there's no better introduction than proving one's usefulness." As they rode back toward the Caldwell homestead, the golden light of late afternoon softened the landscape. Despite the gravity of their mission and the uncertain fate of Ben Tucker, Jackson felt an unexpected sense of purpose settling over him. "You were remarkable today," he told Eleanor as they navigated a steep section of trail. "Your assistance was beyond what I would expect from even an experienced nurse." Eleanor glanced at him, surprise flickering across her features before she composed herself. "Thank you. I've always found medical work compelling, the immediate purpose of it, the tangible difference one can make." She paused. "In Helena, the doctor I trained with allowed me more responsibility than was perhaps conventional because I showed aptitude." "He was wise to do so," Jackson replied. "Skill matters more than convention in medicine, particularly in situations like today's." They rode in companionable silence for a while before Eleanor spoke again. "I believe we passed our first test as partners, Dr. Miller." Looking at her profile against the sunset-painted mountains, Jackson found himself agreeing. Whatever complications lay ahead with the Harringtons or the community's potential reactions to their unusual arrangement, today had proven they could work together effectively when it mattered most. "Indeed we did, Miss Caldwell," he replied. "Indeed we did." 2 weeks after Ben Tucker's accident, the promised land of 20 acres officially became Jackson's property. Eleanor had arranged for the county clerk to ride out from Willow Creek with the necessary documents, and by midday, Jackson had signed his name to the deed. "Congratulations, Dr. Miller," Eleanor said as they watched the clerk ride away. You're now a Montana landowner." Jackson examined the document with a mixture of satisfaction and mild disbelief. After losing everything in Boston, having tangible proof of new beginnings felt significant in ways he hadn't anticipated. "It's strange," he remarked. "I came west expecting an entirely different life arrangement, yet somehow this feels right." Eleanor gave him a sidelong glance. "More right than being married to my sister upon arrival." The question caught him off guard. It was more direct than their usual careful conversations about Abigail. In the 2 weeks since his arrival, they had developed a comfortable working relationship while establishing his practice, but had largely avoided discussing the original arrangement that had brought him west. "I can't answer that definitively," he replied honestly. "But I can say that our current partnership seems better suited to my abilities and temperament than what I had imagined with Abigail." Eleanor nodded, seemingly satisfied with his response. "We should mark the occasion properly. I've prepared a picnic lunch if you'd care to join me by the creek." Jackson agreed readily. The past fortnight had been filled with intense activity. Setting up temporary examination quarters in the cabin, riding out to check on Ben Tucker, who had survived against considerable odds, though remained unconscious, and treating a steady stream of patients who arrived at the Caldwell homestead seeking the new doctor's services. They settled beneath a cottonwood tree near a bend in the creek where the water formed a deep, clear pool. Eleanor spread a blanket and unpacked a basket containing cold chicken, fresh bread, early strawberries, and a bottle of cider. "This is quite civilized," Jackson commented as he accepted a plate. "I had almost forgotten what leisure feels like." "We've both been working too hard," Eleanor acknowledged, "but progress has been remarkable. Your examination room is functional. Word of your skills is spreading after Ben Tucker's surgery, and we've already scheduled appointments through next week." Jackson couldn't argue with her assessment. The practice was taking shape more rapidly than he could have established alone, largely due to Eleanor's efficient organization and local connections. "The credit is partially yours," he pointed out. "Your nursing skills have proven invaluable, and patients clearly trust your judgment." Eleanor's cheeks colored slightly at the praise. "It feels good to finally put my training to proper use. In Helena, I was rarely permitted to do more than observe or assist with the most basic procedures." She took a sip of cider. "You treat me as a colleague rather than a subordinate. It's refreshing." Jackson studied her as she gazed across the creek. In their 2 weeks of partnership, he had come to appreciate not only her medical aptitude, but also her quiet strength. Eleanor possessed none of her twin's apparent mercurial temperament that he had glimpsed in Abigail's occasional letters. Instead, she approached challenges with steady determination and practical solutions. "You've never mentioned why you didn't pursue formal medical training," he said. "You certainly have the intelligence and aptitude." Eleanor's expression grew contemplative. "Father would have supported it. He believed women deserved education equal to men." A shadow crossed her features, but Abigail fell ill with pneumonia during our 18th year. By the time she recovered, I'd missed the application deadline for the Women's Medical College. "In Philadelphia, you could have applied the following year," Jackson observed. "I could have," Eleanor agreed, "but by then Father's health had begun to decline. It seemed impractical to leave when the homestead needed management." She smiled faintly. Besides, Abigail had already claimed the role of the ambitious Caldwell sister. We fell into our respective parts. She, the dreamer with grand plans, me, the practical one who maintained the foundation that supported those dreams. The insight into their relationship explained much about Eleanor's self-sufficient nature and her evident surprise whenever Jackson acknowledged her capabilities. "And now?" he asked. "With your father gone, and Abigail married into the Harrington family?" Eleanor was silent for a moment, plucking a blade of grass and twisting it between her fingers. "Now I find myself wondering which aspects of my life were chosen and which were simply accepted because they seemed expected. She met his gaze directly. I never anticipated having a medical practice here on Caldwell Land. Yet now that it's taking shape, I can't imagine a more fitting purpose. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching riders. Eleanor rose to her feet, shading her eyes as she looked toward the road. 3 riders, she reported. Coming fast. Jackson stood beside her, instantly alert. Trouble? Possibly. Her expression had grown guarded. I recognized the lead horse. It belongs to Thomas Harrington. They quickly packed away the remains of their picnic and walked briskly toward the main house, reaching the front porch just as the riders thundered into the yard. Thomas Harrington was indeed in the lead, a barrel-chested man in his 60s, with iron-grey hair and the florid complexion of someone accustomed to commanding others. Behind him rode a younger man with similar features, who Jackson assumed must be James, Abigail's husband. The third rider was Sheriff Burke, Miss Caldwell, Harrington called without dismounting, his tone falsely jovial. I see the rumors of your houseguest are true. Eleanor stood tall on the porch steps. Mr. Harrington, this is Dr. Jackson Miller, recently established on Caldwell property. Dr. Miller, Thomas Harrington of the Double H Ranch. Jackson stepped forward, maintaining a neutral expression. Mr. Harrington. The older man's gaze assessed him coldly before sliding back to Eleanor. Interesting development considering the arrangement we discussed with Abigail before the wedding. My sister's arrangements are her own, Eleanor replied evenly, as are mine. The younger Harrington, James, spoke up, his voice carrying the polished accent of Eastern education. Eleanor, this is unnecessary antagonism. Father has come with a generous revised offer for your share of the property, taking into account the changed circumstances. The circumstances haven't changed, James, Eleanor countered. I still have no intention of selling. Thomas Harrington's false congeniality vanished. Perhaps you should consider how your sister might feel about you bringing her intended husband onto family property and setting him up in business. Quite the convenient replacement, wouldn't you say, Sheriff? Sheriff Burke looked distinctly uncomfortable. Now, Thomas, I'm just here to keep the peace. The personal arrangements of Miss Caldwell are her own business. Are they? Thomas pressed. When they involve a man who traveled west specifically to marry Abigail? A man who now mysteriously partners with her twin sister instead. The community might find such sudden flexibility of affection rather suspect. Jackson felt anger rising in his chest, but Eleanor's hand on his arm cautioned restraint. Dr. Miller came west to establish a medical practice on Caldwell Land, she stated firmly. That arrangement stands, regardless of my sister's decision to marry into your family instead. The property deed has been filed today with the county clerk, who I believe you passed on the road. This information clearly caught Thomas Harrington by surprise. His eyes narrowed dangerously. You've transferred property without consulting your sister or her husband? My share of the homestead is mine to manage as I see fit, Eleanor replied, just as Abigail's decisions were hers to make. The older Harrington's face darkened. This is a mistake, Miss Caldwell. One you'll come to regret. He turned his attention to Jackson. As for you, Doctor, I suggest you consider carefully which side of this valley holds real power before you become too comfortable. Jackson met the man's gaze steadily. I appreciate the advice, Mr. Harrington. In my experience, however, medical care transcends social divisions. Your ranch hands will need a physician as much as anyone else in this valley. Something dangerous flickered in Thomas Harrington's eyes before he turned his horse sharply. James, we're leaving. Sheriff, I believe our business here is concluded. As the 2 Harrington men rode away, Sheriff Burke lingered momentarily. That could have gone better, he observed dryly. Was there a legitimate reason for your presence, Thomas? Eleanor asked, her composure intact despite the confrontation. The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. Harrington claimed he had concerns about trespassing and property disputes, insisted I accompany them officially. He looked genuinely apologetic. Politics being what they are in this county, I couldn't refuse outright. Eleanor nodded, understanding. The Harrington influence reaches far, though perhaps not as far as Thomas believes, Burke replied meaningfully. Word of Dr. Miller's surgical skill with Ben Tucker has spread. People aren't quick to antagonize a physician who might save their lives someday. He replaced his hat. Just thought you should know that not everyone sees things through Harrington spectacles. After the sheriff departed, Eleanor released a long breath and sank onto the porch steps. That was inevitable, I suppose. Though I'd hoped for more time before the confrontation, Jackson sat beside her. Harrington strikes me as a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. He's built an empire using that approach. Eleanor confirmed. The Double H Ranch controls nearly 60,000 acres east of here. Thomas Harrington has ambitions to own the entire valley before he passes the operation to James. And our 20 acres stands in his way? Eleanor shook her head. It's not just 20 acres. It's the entire Caldwell homestead, nearly 800 acres of prime valley land with some of the best water rights in the territory. Abigail's marriage was supposed to facilitate the transfer of all Caldwell holdings into Harrington control. Jackson considered this. So by establishing my practice here and refusing to sell, we've directly challenged his expansion plans. And embarrassed him publicly, Eleanor added. Thomas Harrington doesn't forget such affronts. What can we expect next? Jackson asked, his mind already calculating potential threats and necessary precautions. Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. Nothing direct. Not yet. The Harringtons operate through influence and economic pressure. They may attempt to discourage patients from seeking your services or suppliers from doing business with us. She glanced at him. Are you having second thoughts about our arrangement? Jackson surprised himself with the immediacy of his response. Not in the slightest. I've faced entitled bullies in Boston society. Harrington is merely a frontier version of the same species. A smile tugged at Eleanor's lips. Then we proceed as planned. The examination room is functional, supplies are organized, and according to Sheriff Burke, your reputation is growing. She rose to her feet with renewed purpose. Besides, we have 3 patients scheduled for tomorrow morning. Harrington theatrics notwithstanding, there's work to be done. As they walked into the house together, Jackson reflected that their partnership had just been tested in an unexpected way and had emerged stronger for it. The threat presented by the Harringtons clarified what might otherwise have remained ambiguous. He and Eleanor now stood definitively as allies against common adversaries. For a man who had arrived in Montana less than 3 weeks prior, expecting a conventional marriage to a woman he'd never met, Jackson found himself embracing this unconventional alliance with surprising readiness. Eleanor Caldwell might not be the bride he had journeyed west to claim, but she was proving to be exactly the partner he needed. May yielded to June, bringing longer days and the vibrant green of full summer to the valley. In the month since the Harrington's confrontational visit, Jackson and Eleanor had fallen into an efficient rhythm. Mornings were dedicated to scheduled patient visits at the cabin, which they had gradually transformed into a functional clinic. Afternoons often involved house calls to those too ill or injured to travel, while evenings were spent reviewing cases, organizing supplies, and planning improvements to the practice. The partnership flourished, drawing strength from their complementary abilities. Jackson brought formal medical training and surgical expertise, while Eleanor contributed practical nursing skills, knowledge of local remedies, and an intuitive understanding of their patients' needs that went beyond symptoms to encompass family, circumstances, and living conditions, On this particular morning, Jackson found himself alone in the clinic, reviewing his notes on a difficult case, a young ranch hand suffering from a mysterious wasting illness that had thus far defied diagnosis. Eleanor had ridden to the Tucker homestead to check on Ben's continuing recovery and deliver medicines for the family's youngest child, who had developed a persistent cough. The sound of an approaching wagon drew Jackson to the cabin's window. A farm wagon pulled by two sturdy workhorses rolled into the yard. Driven by a middle-aged man Jackson recognized as Martin Dawson, whose wife he had treated for dropsy the previous week. In the wagon bed, carefully arranged on a mattress, lay a teenage boy, his face contorted with pain. Jackson grabbed his medical bag and hurried outside. "Mr. Dawson, what's happened?" "It's my boy Caleb," Dawson replied, the worry evident in his weathered face. "Farm accident. Machine caught his arm bad. Eleanor, Miss Caldwell, she ain't here." "She's checking on another patient," Jackson explained, already moving to examine the boy. "But I'm here. Let's get him inside." With Dawson's help, Jackson carefully transferred the injured teenager to the examination table inside the clinic. The boy's right arm was wrapped in blood-soaked cloths, and his complexion had the grey pallor of significant blood loss and shock. "Martha did what she could to stop the bleeding," Dawson explained, referring to his wife, "but it wouldn't quit proper. Boy's been fading on the ride over." Jackson worked quickly, unwrapping the makeshift bandages to reveal the extent of the damage. The arm had been partially severed just below the elbow, with splintered bone protruding from mangled flesh. The injury was severe, but not beyond surgical intervention. "I need to operate immediately," Jackson told Dawson, already reaching for chloroform and surgical instruments. "He's lost significant blood, but the arm can be saved if we act quickly." Dawson's eyes widened. "Save it? Doc, I thought for sure." "Modern surgical techniques make salvage possible in cases like this," Jackson explained, washing his hands thoroughly in the carbolic solution Eleanor always kept prepared. "But I'll need your assistance, Mr. Dawson. Can you follow directions?" "Precisely," the farmer straightened his shoulders. "Just tell me what to do, Doc." For the next 2 hours, Jackson worked methodically to repair the devastating injury, first administering chloroform, then meticulously cleaning the wound, realigning shattered bones, and suturing damaged blood vessels and muscle tissue. Dawson proved a capable assistant, steadfastly following Jackson's instructions despite the gruesome nature of the procedure. As Jackson tied the final suture and began bandaging the reconstructed limb, he allowed himself a moment of professional satisfaction. Without the surgical techniques he had learned from Boston's leading physicians, amputation would have been the only option. Now, while the boy would face a long recovery and might never regain full function, he would at least keep his arm. "He'll need careful observation for infection," Jackson instructed Dawson as they moved the unconscious boy to a recovery cot. "And regular dressing changes. Can you remain here until he wakes? I want to monitor his condition for several hours." Dawson nodded vigorously. "Course, Doc. Whatever's needed." Jackson had just finished documenting the procedure when the clinic door opened, admitting Eleanor. She paused on the threshold, taking in the scene, the bloodied instruments soaking in carbolic solution, the pale boy on the cot, and Dawson sitting vigilantly beside his son. "Martin," she acknowledged, moving immediately to examine the patient. "What happened?" As Dawson explained the accident, Eleanor assessed Jackson's work with professional interest. "Remarkable reconstruction," she commented quietly. "Most frontier doctors would have amputated without hesitation. Modern surgical techniques make salvage possible when the vasculature can be preserved," Jackson explained, aware of the pride in his voice. "Though he'll need careful rehabilitation to regain functionality." Eleanor's eyes met his with unmistakable respect. "I'll develop a program of graduated exercises once healing begins." She turned to Dawson. "You should send word to Martha that Caleb will remain here tonight. We'll monitor him closely, and you can take him home tomorrow if his condition remains stable." The grateful farmer departed to inform his wife, leaving Jackson and Eleanor with their patient. "You've performed another minor miracle, Dr. Miller," Eleanor remarked as they cleaned the operating area together. "First Ben Tucker, now Caleb Dawson. Your reputation will soon eclipse the doctor in Helena." Jackson shook his head modestly. "Hardly miracles. Simply the application of surgical techniques that are becoming standard in Eastern hospitals, but haven't yet reached frontier medicine." "Nevertheless," Eleanor persisted, "you're bringing a level of care to this valley that wasn't available before. People notice such things." Her words made Jackson reflect on how much his life had changed in just 6 weeks. The devastating loss in Boston that had driven him west now seemed like the necessary catalyst for a more fulfilling practice than he could have established there. Here in Montana, each procedure mattered profoundly, not just to the patient, but to entire families and, increasingly, to the community's perception of what medical care could achieve. The remainder of the day passed in steady activity. Caleb regained consciousness by late afternoon, groggy but stable. Jackson frequently checked his pulse and temperature, while Eleanor prepared a nourishing broth to help rebuild the boy's strength after his ordeal. As evening approached, Martin Dawson returned with his wife Martha, who insisted on staying the night with her son. Eleanor prepared the small adjacent room for the couple, while Jackson gave final instructions for monitoring the boy's condition. "We'll check on him periodically through the night," Jackson assured them, "but call immediately if you notice any change in his breathing or temperature." With their patient settled for the night, Jackson and Eleanor finally walked back to the main house as twilight descended over the valley. The first stars were appearing in the deepening blue sky, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wild lupine blooming along the creek banks. "You must be exhausted," Eleanor observed as they crossed the yard. "That was complex surgery under difficult conditions." Jackson rolled his shoulders to release the tension. It was challenging, certainly, but satisfying in a way Boston practice rarely achieved. He glanced at her. "How was Ben Tucker progressing?" "Remarkably well, considering the severity of his injuries," Eleanor replied. "The amputation site has healed cleanly. He's managing to sit up with assistance, though of course the spinal damage means his lower limbs remain paralyzed. His mental faculties intact. He's adapted to his circumstances with extraordinary resilience." Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. "Mary has designed a wheeled chair that allows him limited mobility around their cabin. Their oldest boy helps position him by the claim office each day so he can still oversee the mining operation." Jackson nodded, impressed by the family's adaptability. Human determination remains our most powerful healing resource. As they reached the house, the domestic scents of baking bread and simmering stew greeted them. Eleanor had hired a local widow, Mrs. Brennan, to help with household duties while they focused on the medical practice. The arrangement had proven beneficial for everyone, providing Eleanor more time for nursing duties, ensuring proper meals were available despite their irregular schedule, and offering Mrs. Brennan needed income and company. "Dr. Miller?" The older woman greeted them from the kitchen doorway. "A package arrived for you today. I've placed it on the desk in the study." Jackson thanked her, curious about what delivery might have reached him in this remote location. In the study, he found a substantial parcel wrapped in brown paper and sealed with wax, bearing the return address of his former medical colleague in Boston. "Dr. Samuel Whitcomb," he explained to Eleanor, who had followed him with evident curiosity. "I wrote to him shortly after arriving, requesting certain medical texts and specialized instruments that would be difficult to obtain locally." Opening the package revealed several modern surgical texts, a set of precision instruments for ophthalmic and dental procedures, and a personal letter from his friend. Jackson scanned the correspondence quickly, then frowned. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor asked, noting his expression. "Possibly." Jackson replied, handing her the letter. "Samuel mentions that a man has been making inquiries about me in Boston, specifically about the circumstances of my departure and my current whereabouts." Eleanor read the relevant passage aloud. The fellow claimed to represent potential investors seeking physician partnerships for frontier medical practices, but his questions seemed unnecessarily focused on your financial situation before the fire and whether you left Boston under any cloud of suspicion. "I provided no information, of course, but thought you should be aware of these inquiries." She lowered the letter, meeting Jackson's gaze with concern. "The Harringtons." Jackson nodded. "It seems the most likely explanation. Thomas Harrington is searching for leverage, perhaps hoping to discover some scandal or impropriety in my past that could be used to discredit me here." "Would he find anything?" Eleanor asked directly. "Nothing legitimate," Jackson assured her. "The fire was investigated thoroughly and determined to be accidental, originating in the neighboring bakery. My practice was financially strained, but not insolvent. I had no improper relationships with patients or staff. My medical record was unblemished." Eleanor's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Then his investigation will yield nothing useful, unless he fabricates something," Jackson pointed out. "A man willing to threaten a lone woman over property rights wouldn't hesitate to spread false rumors about a newcomer." They were interrupted by Mrs. Brennan announcing that dinner was ready. Throughout the meal, Jackson could see Eleanor mentally working through the implications of this development, her brow occasionally furrowing in concentration before smoothing again as she reached some internal conclusion. It wasn't until they retired to the porch with coffee that she finally shared her thoughts. "We need to strengthen your position in the community before any potential rumors can take hold," she stated, her tone businesslike. "The surgical successes help, but we should be more deliberate in establishing your credentials and character." "What do you suggest?" Jackson asked, impressed by her strategic thinking. Eleanor sipped her coffee, considering. "The Independence Day celebration is 3 weeks away. The entire valley gathers at Willow Creek for the festivities. You should deliver a lecture on modern medical practices, something to formally introduce yourself to those you haven't yet treated and reinforce your expertise." The suggestion was sound. Such public presentations had been common practice among Boston physicians establishing new specialties. "Additionally," Eleanor continued, "we should accelerate our plans for constructing the permanent clinic building. Visible investment in the community signals long-term commitment." Jackson nodded agreement. "Both excellent suggestions, though the construction will strain our current resources." Eleanor's expression grew determined. "I've been conserving funds from the practice proceeds. Combined with what remains of my personal savings, we should have enough to begin the foundation and framework. Progress, even if gradual, makes a statement of permanence that the Harringtons can't easily dismiss." As they discussed these plans in the gathering darkness, Jackson found himself once again appreciating Eleanor's practical intelligence and quiet strength. What had begun as an arrangement of convenience was evolving into a partnership he valued more with each passing day, one worth defending against the Harringtons' machinations. "Whatever Thomas Harrington attempts," he said finally, "we'll face it together. Our work here matters too much to abandon over threats and rumors." Eleanor's smile in the dim lamplight conveyed both gratitude and resolve. "Indeed it does, Dr. Miller. Indeed it does." The day of Willow Creek's Independence Day celebration dawned bright and clear. Jackson adjusted his tie for the 3rd time, uncomfortable in the formal attire he hadn't worn since leaving Boston. Eleanor had insisted that appearance mattered for his public lecture, and he had reluctantly donned his best suit, freshly pressed by Mrs. Brennan. "You look entirely professional," Eleanor assured him, appearing in the doorway of his room. She herself was dressed more formally than usual. in a blue calico dress with white trim, her chestnut hair arranged in an elegant knot. The community needs to see you as both the capable frontier physician they've come to know and the educated Boston doctor you were trained to be. Jackson nodded, reaching for his medical bag. Inside, he had packed visual aids for his presentation, anatomical, drawings, examples of modern surgical tools, and samples of the newest pharmaceutical preparations he had brought from the East. "Are you nervous about your lecture?" Eleanor asked as they descended the stairs together. "Not about the medical content," Jackson admitted, "but addressing the entire community with the Harringtons likely in attendance. That gives me pause." Eleanor's expression grew determined. "The Harringtons don't own this celebration or this community, despite what Thomas might believe. Your knowledge and the care you've already provided to so many families will speak louder than any rumors or intimidation." They departed in the wagon Eleanor had decorated for the occasion with small American flags and a professionally painted sign announcing Dr. J. Miller, physician and surgeon, Willow Creek Valley. The gesture had surprised Jackson when he first saw it that morning, a public declaration of his establishment in the community. "The sign is quite official," he had commented, touching the carefully lettered words. "Peterson at the general store does excellent work," Eleanor had replied. "After the celebration, it will hang outside the new clinic building, once construction begins next week." Now, as they traveled toward town, Jackson noticed more wagons and riders converging on the same destination. Families in their Sunday best waved greetings as they passed. Several called out specific thanks to Doc Miller for previous treatments, a child's broken arm, a complicated delivery, an elderly father's rheumatism remedy. Each acknowledgement reinforced what Jackson had come to realize over the past weeks. In this frontier community, a physician's worth was measured not by academic credentials or social connections, as in Boston, but by practical results and willingness to serve regardless of a patient's standing. Willow Creek had transformed for the celebration. The normally quiet main street was festooned with bunting and flags. Temporary tables laden with food lined the area near the schoolhouse, where children raced excitedly in their best clothes. A platform had been constructed outside the town hall for speeches and presentations, including Jackson's scheduled lecture. As they secured their wagon and unloaded Jackson's materials, Sheriff Burke approached with a welcoming smile. "Doc Miller, Miss Caldwell," he greeted them. "Good to see you both. Quite a turnout this year." "The entire valley seems to have arrived," Eleanor observed, surveying the growing crowd. Burke nodded. "Independence Day is our biggest gathering, even bigger than Christmas services. Only chance some of the outlying homesteaders have to socialize all year." He lowered his voice slightly. "Harringtons arrived about an hour ago. All of them." Jackson understood the warning implicit in the sheriff's tone. "All of them?" "Thomas and his wife James and—" Burke glanced at Eleanor apologetically. "Your sister, Miss Caldwell. First public appearance since the wedding." Eleanor's expression remained composed, though Jackson noticed her shoulders tighten almost imperceptibly. "Thank you for letting us know, Thomas. We expected as much." As the sheriff moved on to greet other arrivals, Jackson turned to Eleanor. "Are you prepared to see Abigail? It's been nearly 3 months since she left." "I'm more concerned about how she'll react to seeing you established here," Eleanor replied pragmatically. "My sister doesn't appreciate unexpected alterations to her plans, even those of her own making." Before Jackson could respond, they were approached by Reverend Finch, the community's minister and head of the celebration committee. "Dr. Miller, so pleased you could participate today," the Reverend said enthusiastically. "Your lecture is scheduled for 2 o'clock, after the patriotic speeches but before the community meal. Perfect timing to capture everyone's attention." Jackson thanked him, and after confirming the arrangements for his presentation materials, he and Eleanor made their way through the crowd. They stopped frequently to greet patients and neighbors, with Jackson providing brief medical advice and Eleanor discussing follow-up visits and treatment adjustments. Dr. Miller called Martha Dawson, approaching with her son Caleb, whose injured arm rested in a professionally crafted sling. "We've been hoping to find you today." Jackson smiled warmly at the teenager, whose color had improved significantly since the dramatic surgery. "Caleb, how is the arm feeling?" "Still painful, sir," the boy admitted, "but I can move my fingers now, just like you said I might." He demonstrated with visible pride, wiggling his fingers slightly. "Excellent progress," Jackson affirmed. "Careful not to overstate the prognosis. We'll continue the exercises Miss Caldwell designed. With diligent effort, you may regain considerable function." Martha Dawson clasped Jackson's hand emotionally. "We can never repay what you've done, Doctor. Martin tells everyone how you saved our boy's arm when most doctors would have taken it without trying." Such encounters repeated throughout the morning, each reinforcing Jackson's growing attachment to this community and its people. The gratitude expressed was genuine, without the social pretense he had often encountered in Boston society. It was nearly noon when Jackson first spotted the Harrington contingent across the crowded street. Thomas and his wife stood conversing with several wealthy ranchers, while James Harrington distributed cigars to a group of well-dressed men with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to currying favor. And there, standing slightly apart from the others, was Abigail Caldwell. Harrington. The resemblance to Eleanor was indeed remarkable. Same chestnut hair, same delicate features, yet the differences were immediately apparent to Jackson. Where Eleanor's expressions were thoughtful and direct, Abigail's held a calculated vivacity. Her dress was noticeably more elaborate than other women's festival attire, and her gestures, as she spoke to surrounding admirers, were more theatrical. "She always did enjoy being the center of attention," Eleanor murmured, following Jackson's gaze. "Even as children." Before Jackson could reply, Abigail glanced in their direction. Her animated expression froze momentarily as she registered their presence, her eyes widening first at the sight of Jackson, then narrowing slightly as they shifted to her twin. What followed happened too quickly for Jackson to intercept. Abigail excused herself from her companions and cut directly through the crowd toward them, her smile fixed in place, but her eyes sharp with calculation. "Eleanor, darling sister," she called, embracing Eleanor with practiced affection. "How wonderful to see you after so long. Marriage has kept me terribly busy." "Abigail," Eleanor returned evenly, "you're looking well. Montana agrees with you, it seems." "And with you," Abigail countered, her gaze sliding to Jackson. "Though perhaps not in ways I anticipated." Jackson extended his hand formally. "Mrs. Harrington, I'm Dr. Jackson Miller. I believe we had a prior arrangement by correspondence." Abigail's laugh held a brittle edge. "Indeed we did, Dr. Miller. How fascinating to find you so comfortably established with my sister instead." She turned back to Eleanor. "Really, Ellie, I never took you for the type to claim another's leavings, though I suppose practical considerations outweighed sentiment." Eleanor's composure never wavered. "Dr. Miller and I have established a medical practice that serves the entire valley, Abigail, a professional partnership beneficial to everyone." "Professional," Abigail repeated, her tone making the word sound dubious. "How convenient for both of you." Her smile sharpened. "Father-in-law is quite displeased about the land transfer, you know. He had plans for that northern section." "I'm aware," Eleanor replied coolly. "However, the Caldwell homestead is jointly ours, with my half mind to manage as I see fit, just as you managed your portion through marriage." Something dangerous flickered in Abigail's eyes. "Well, sister dear, I'm sure your arrangement with Dr. Miller provides adequate compensation for your stubbornness, though one must wonder what the good people of Willow Creek think of such unconventional living situations." Jackson felt anger rising at the deliberate insinuation in Abigail's words. "Mrs. Harrington, your implication is both inaccurate and inappropriate." "Is it?" Abigail arched an eyebrow. "Two unmarried adults sharing a home, regardless of claimed professional justifications. Montana society may be less refined than Boston, Doctor, but certain standards of propriety still apply." Eleanor touched Jackson's arm lightly, cautioning restraint. "My reputation in this valley was established long before Dr. Miller's arrival, Abigail. The community understands the nature of our partnership." "For now, perhaps," Abigail conceded, with false sweetness. "But perceptions can change so quickly with the right word in the right ear." She glanced over her shoulder to where her husband stood watching their interaction. "James is signaling for me. Family obligations, you understand. Do enjoy the festivities." With that parting shot, she swept away, leaving a wake of tension behind her. "I begin to understand why you described your sister as having a different temperament," Jackson said quietly once Abigail was out of earshot. Eleanor sighed. "She wasn't always so calculating. Father's death changed her, or perhaps revealed what was always beneath the surface." She straightened her shoulders. "Regardless, her threats are clear. She intends to undermine your position and our arrangement. Through gossip and insinuation," Jackson considered this. "Her approach seems less direct than her father-in-law's intimidation tactics, but potentially more damaging," Eleanor pointed out. "Medical expertise can overcome many obstacles, but questions about moral character are harder to dispel." They had little time to develop counter-strategies, as Reverend Finch soon approached to escort Jackson to the platform for his presentation. As they walked toward the gathering audience, Jackson noticed that news of his upcoming lecture had spread. Nearly the entire celebration attendance was arranging itself before the platform. "Largest turnout we've had for a speaker in years," the Reverend commented approvingly. "Usually it's just the patriotic addresses that draw the full crowd." Jackson ascended the steps, arranging his materials on the small table provided. Scanning the audience, he noted Eleanor standing supportively near the front, the Harrington family positioned prominently in the center, and dozens of families he had treated spread throughout the gathering. As Reverend Finch introduced him with enthusiastic praise for the medical services already provided to the community, Jackson made a swift decision. His carefully prepared lecture on modern surgical techniques would demonstrate his professional knowledge, certainly. But something more was needed to counter the subtle threat Abigail had just delivered. When he stepped forward to speak, Jackson set aside his notes and addressed the crowd directly. "Friends and neighbors of Willow Creek Valley," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed gathering. "I arrived in Montana Territory just 2 months ago, a stranger bringing nothing but medical training and a desire to establish a new beginning after losing everything in Boston." His gaze swept the crowd, lingering briefly on the Harringtons before continuing. "What I found here was something Boston's sophisticated society often lacks: genuine community. People who judge a man not by his pedigree or social connections, but by the work of his hands and the integrity of his actions." Heads nodded throughout the audience, and Jackson felt encouraged to continue this unplanned direction. "I came west expecting one life and found another, one I've come to value more deeply with each passing day. With Miss Caldwell's partnership, we've established a medical practice dedicated to bringing modern care to every family in this valley, regardless of means or standing." From the corner of his eye, Jackson saw Thomas Harrington shift uncomfortably. Beside him, Abigail whispered something to her husband, her expression displeased. "Today, I'd like to share not just medical knowledge, but a personal commitment," Jackson continued. "I am here to stay, invested in this community's well-being for the long term. Construction begins next week on a permanent clinic that will serve Willow Creek Valley for generations to come. As murmurs of approval spread through the crowd, Jackson launched into his prepared remarks on medical advancements, but the personal introduction had achieved its purpose. He had publicly declared his permanent commitment to the community and his professional partnership with Eleanor, making any subsequent rumors easier to dismiss as Harrington manipulation. By the time he concluded his presentation, having covered everything from antiseptic surgical techniques to the latest treatments for common frontier ailments, Jackson knew he had captured the community's attention and respect. The enthusiastic applause confirmed what Eleanor had suggested. In establishing himself publicly as both educated physician and committed community member, he had strengthened his position against whatever strategies the Harringtons might employ. Next, as he descended from the platform, Eleanor met him with unmistakable approval in her eyes. "That was masterfully done," she said quietly. "Especially the unscripted beginning." Jackson smiled. "I thought it necessary, given your sister's thinly veiled threats." "It was perfect," Eleanor affirmed, "and judging by Thomas Harrington's expression, entirely effective." Looking across the dispersing crowd to where the Harrington patriarch stood in apparent debate with his son and daughter-in-law, Jackson allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Whatever challenge came next, he and Eleanor had established a foundation of community support that would not easily be undermined. August brought relentless heat to Willow Creek Valley, scorching the grasslands golden brown and reducing the creek to a fraction of its spring volume. Construction on the new clinic proceeded steadily, despite the punishing temperatures, with local men volunteering labor on days when ranch duties permitted. The timber frame now stood complete, a tangible symbol of permanence that defied Thomas Harrington's earlier threats. Jackson wiped sweat from his brow as he examined the structure's progress. Tomorrow, a group of volunteers would begin installing the siding, bringing them one step closer to completion before autumn's cooler weather arrived. "It's larger than I initially envisioned," he commented to Eleanor, who had joined him after finishing her rounds at the temporary clinic. "We've already outgrown the cabin," she pointed out practically. "Last week, patients were waiting outside for hours. Better to build with future expansion in mind." She was right, of course. Their practice had flourished since the independence. Day celebration, drawing patients from increasingly distant homesteads and mining camps. Word had spread about the Boston doctor who saves limbs instead of removing them, bringing complicated cases that would once have required the arduous journey to Helena. The increased patient load had also transformed their working relationship. Where once they had functioned as physician and nurse, they now operated as near equals in many aspects of treatment. Jackson had begun teaching Eleanor more advanced procedures, finding her a quick study with natural surgical aptitude. In turn, she had deepened his understanding of herbal medicine and practical adaptations necessary in frontier healthcare. Their personal relationship had similarly evolved, growing more comfortable with each passing week. Shared meals had become opportunities for wide-ranging conversations rather than merely functional necessities. Evening walks along the creek had developed into a pleasant routine, allowing them to discuss difficult cases away from the homestead's constant activity. "Dr. Miller, Miss Caldwell." Sheriff Burke's voice interrupted Jackson's reflections. The lawman was approaching on horseback, riding hard from the direction of town. Eleanor tensed beside him. "Thomas, what's happened?" Burke dismounted swiftly, his expression grave. "Stage from Helena just arrived, brought telegrams and mail." He extended a telegram envelope to Jackson. "This came for you, Doc, marked urgent." Jackson accepted the envelope with apprehension. Telegrams rarely brought positive news, especially those marked urgent. Breaking the seal, he quickly scanned. The brief message, his expression darkening. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, concern evident in her voice. Jackson handed her the telegram. "From my colleague in Boston. The man making inquiries about me has escalated his efforts. He's now claiming I misappropriated patient funds before the fire and fled Boston to escape prosecution." Eleanor's eyes widened as she read. "This is outrageous. There's no truth to these accusations. None whatsoever," Jackson confirmed grimly, "but the damage may already be spreading. Samuel writes that the claims are being circulated among medical societies and have reached several Western territorial newspapers." Sheriff Burke cleared his throat uncomfortably. "That explains the other development. Helena newspaper arrived on today's stage with a small article questioning whether Montana Territory has become a haven for Eastern criminals escaping justice." He grimaced. "Specifically mentions a Boston physician now practicing near Willow Creek without naming you directly." Jackson felt cold despite the August heat. Harrington's work without question. He's moved from local intimidation to a broader campaign of character assassination. "There's more," Burke added reluctantly. "Judge Wilson arrived on today's stage. As well, he's scheduled a county hearing for next Monday regarding your medical credentials and fitness to practice." "A hearing?" Eleanor's voice rose in disbelief. "On what grounds?" "Protecting public welfare through proper verification of medical qualifications," Burke quoted sourly, "given the disturbing reports from Eastern sources." Jackson's mind raced. Through implications and potential responses. Judge Wilson, is he connected to the Harringtons? "His brother-in-law manages the Double H Ranch's Helena operations," Burke confirmed. "Though Wilson generally maintains judicial independence despite the connection." Eleanor's expression had shifted from shock to determination. "We'll need to prepare a formal defense. Your Boston credentials, testimonials from patients you've treated here, perhaps telegrams from medical colleagues attesting to your character." Jackson nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. Character assassination was notoriously difficult to counter, especially when orchestrated by someone with the Harringtons' resources and influence. Even if he successfully defended his credentials, the whispers would linger, potentially undermining patient trust. "I should return to Boston," he said quietly. "Confront these allegations directly at their source." "No." Eleanor's response was immediate and emphatic. "That's precisely what Thomas Harrington wants, to drive you away, so I'm isolated again, pressured to sell without your support." Sheriff Burke shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Caldwell's right, Doc. Leaving now, even temporarily, would be seen as admission of guilt." He adjusted his hat. "I should get back to town. Word's spreading about the newspaper article, and I want to gauge the community's reaction." After the sheriff departed, Jackson and Eleanor walked silently toward the main house, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The golden afternoon light that had earlier seemed so promising now felt like a mocking counterpoint to the shadow suddenly cast over their future. At the house, Mrs. Brennan greeted them with the news that Ben Tucker had arrived for his scheduled therapy session. Despite the turmoil of the telegram's revelations, they maintained professional composure, helping the recovering miner with the exercises designed to strengthen his upper body and teaching him new techniques for managing daily activities from his wheeled chair. Only after Tucker departed did they return to the crisis at hand, retreating to the study where they could speak privately. "We need to understand exactly what we're facing," Eleanor said, her practical nature asserting itself. "The newspaper innuendos, the judicial hearing, the Boston rumors, they're all connected, clearly orchestrated by Thomas Harrington." Jackson paced the room, frustration evident in his movements. "The timing is deliberate as well. With the new clinic nearing completion, our position in the community strengthening, Harrington needed to act before we became too established to challenge." Eleanor watched him thoughtfully. "There's something we're missing here. This level of effort seems excessive, even for Thomas Harrington. spreading false accusations across multiple territories, involving judicial proceedings. It's extraordinarily vindictive, even for him. Perhaps it's not just about acquiring your land, Jackson suggested. Maybe I've somehow become a personal affront to his authority or pride. Eleanor shook her head. No, there's something more specific driving this campaign. She rose suddenly. I need to speak with Abigail. Jackson stared at her in surprise. Your sister, after her behavior at the Independence Day celebration? Precisely because of that behavior, Eleanor explained. Abigail always knows more than she reveals. If anyone understands Thomas Harrington's true motivations, it's her. She moved toward the door with newfound purpose. I'll ride to the Double H tomorrow morning. Not alone, Jackson insisted. I'll accompany you. Eleanor turned back, her expression softening. Your presence would only inflame the situation. Jackson, Abigail might speak candidly to me alone, sister to sister. With you there, she'll perform for her in-law's benefit. Though reluctant, Jackson recognized the wisdom in her assessment. Be careful. The Harringtons are clearly willing to go to extraordinary lengths to achieve their aims. Eleanor's smile held unexpected warmth. I've survived 28 years. As Abigail Caldwell's twin, I know how to navigate her currents and eddies better than anyone. The following morning, Eleanor departed at dawn, dressed in her finest riding habit and projecting a confidence Jackson suspected was at least partially manufactured. He spent the anxious day divided between patient care and preparations for the upcoming judicial hearing, gathering documentation of his medical credentials and writing to former colleagues requesting telegraphed character references. Eleanor didn't return until dusk was settling over the valley. Jackson was on the porch before she had fully dismounted, alarmed by her extended absence. What happened? He asked, helping her down from the saddle. I was beginning to worry. Eleanor's expression was difficult to read in the fading light. Let's go inside. What I've learned changes everything. In the study, with the door firmly closed against Mrs. Brennan's well-intentioned curiosity, Eleanor paced the room, gathering her thoughts before speaking. Thomas Harrington has staked mineral claims on the northern reaches of Caldwell land, our land, she finally revealed. Or rather, on your 20 acres specifically. Jackson frowned in confusion. Mineral claims? But there's been no indication of valuable deposits there. Because they've been deliberately concealed, Eleanor explained, her voice taut with suppressed anger. Abigail knew. She's known since before her wedding. The Harrington Mining Company conducted secret explorations last spring while father was still alive but too ill to monitor the property boundaries. What did they find? Jackson asked, already suspecting the answer. Copper, Eleanor confirmed. A potentially significant deposit extending from existing Harrington claims onto what is now your land, possibly the richest vein in the region, according to what Abigail let slip. The pieces suddenly aligned with devastating clarity. So, this was never simply about grazing land or water rights. The Harringtons need my property specifically because of what lies beneath it. Eleanor nodded grimly. The marriage alliance was supposed to solve the problem neatly. Once Abigail was a Harrington, they assumed I would sell my share of the homestead without question. When I refused, they shifted strategies. And when I arrived and we established the medical practice together, their timeline was threatened. Jackson continued, following the logic. My presence strengthened your position and complicated their acquisition plans. Exactly. Eleanor sank into a chair, the day's tension visibly catching up with her. What I don't understand is why Abigail revealed this now. She was surprisingly forthcoming, almost apologetic. Jackson considered this unexpected development. Perhaps she didn't anticipate how far her father-in-law would go in pursuing the mineral rights, Character assassination and judicial manipulation might exceed even her comfort with deception. Perhaps, Eleanor agreed, though she sounded unconvinced. Or perhaps she's playing some deeper game I haven't yet discerned. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications of this new information. This changes our approach to the hearing, Jackson finally said. If we can expose the Harringtons' mineral interests as the true motivation behind these fabricated charges. Eleanor straightened, her expression clearing as a new possibility emerged. Not just expose them, leverage them. Thomas Harrington has gone to extraordinary lengths to keep these copper deposits secret while he secures additional claims in the area. Jackson caught her meaning immediately. Information that valuable creates its own form of power. Precisely. Eleanor's smile held a new confidence. We need to consult with Judge Patterson in Helena. He's no friend of the Harringtons and understands mining law better than anyone in the territory. Can we reach Helena and back before Monday's hearing? Jackson asked, already calculating the journey's demands. If we leave before dawn tomorrow, Eleanor confirmed. It's ambitious, but possible. As they quickly formulated plans for the urgent trip, arranging patient coverage and preparing necessary documents, Jackson was struck by the seamless way they worked together, anticipating each other's thoughts and addressing potential obstacles before they arose. What had begun as an arrangement of necessity had evolved into something far more substantial. A partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and growing personal connection. Whatever the outcome of their confrontation with the Harringtons, that foundation would remain unshaken. Dawn had not yet broken when they departed the following morning, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten as their horses carried them toward Helena and the legal counsel that might transform defensive reactions into strategic advantage. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time since the threatening telegram's arrival, Jackson felt genuine optimism about their prospects. The mail-order husband who had arrived to find his bride already married had inadvertently discovered something far more valuable than the marriage contract he'd originally sought, a true partnership with a woman whose strength, intelligence, and integrity matched his own. Whatever challenges the Harringtons might yet devise, they would face them together, their bond forged through shared purpose and deepening affection that neither copper deposits nor judicial hearings could undermine. As the sun finally crested, the eastern mountains illuminating their path forward, Jackson glanced at Eleanor riding confidently beside him. She met his gaze with a smile that conveyed more than words could express, determination certainly, but also the unspoken acknowledgement that their journey together had only just begun. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.